Hi everyone, welcome. We're just going to wait a minute or so for folks to file in, and then we'll be getting started. Looks like we still have a few people coming in, so we're going to wait another minute. Thank you everyone for your patience. Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll get started right now. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hello and welcome again to the latest BioOne Publisher Forum, How to Build Strong Submissions Pipelines for Uncertain Times. Today we'll be discussing how to keep authors and society members engaged in your publications, cultivating strong author tools, changes to impact factor calculations and how to increase impact factors, and how to keep academic societies relevant in your everyday work. I'm Alexandra Frankel. I am the BioOne Publisher Relations Associate, and I am so excited to be joined today by our two panelists, Aaron B. Johnson, who is a publishing and strategy consultant, as an experienced academic publishing professional and an advocate for STM and humanities and social sciences societies. Aaron has helped develop their publishing portfolios to grow portfolio impact, reputation, and financial return. And he is well versed in different content, a number of different content types, journals, books, ebooks, etc. And Jon Speilburg is also joining us today. He is the manager of publishing strategy and partnership at SPI, the International Society for Optics and Photonics. We're so excited to have him here today, as SPI is one of our partners and with BioOne, and he's also previously worked as an acquisitions editor at Sage Publishing and as a commissioning editor at Cambridge. And before we continue today, I just want to go over some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded currently, and it will be distributed to all of the registrants after the webinar closes. We will have a question and answer section at the end of the webinar, and to ask questions, please use the question panel in the window on your right-hand corner, or on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can ask questions anytime throughout the meeting, and we will get to those at the end. And so without any further ado, I hand it over to Aaron and Jon.
Ali, thank you very much. Good late morning to everyone here on the East Coast. Good afternoon to anyone calling in from Europe. And good early morning to anyone coming in from the West Coast of the United States. Jon and I have prepared a broad overview of the publishing landscape. We're going to touch a little bit upon impact factors as well as social media. What today won't offer are fine-grained tactical explorations about what has to happen or what should happen with your respective journal, because with a lot of different partners here on today's presentation call, not one size fits all. With that being said, let's get into the publishing landscape in overview. So here on this title card, we've outlined traditional landscape, where publishing came from, particularly in the analog world, which dominated primarily through the end of the 20th century. Disruptive technologies, essentially digital tools that came on board in the mid to late 1990s and which have become ubiquitous and have become the de facto standard. And then movements that tap those digital tools and dissemination of knowledge. And of course, what we're speaking about here is not just open science, but open access, sometimes conflated with free access. And we'll piece that apart. And what that really means is talking about green open access, which is typically the author version of the manuscript posted to a repository. Gold open access, which is typically on the article level, making the article open access from first instance of publication. Also can refer to 100% gold open access journals. Then you have hybrid, which are, say, subscription journals, which accommodate individual gold open access articles. And then just to confuse it, we've also will have diamond. Diamond sometimes conflated as well with platinum open access, which is typically supported by an entity where there's no cost to the author or to the reader. And then you also have bronze, which is a category you'll find in Clarivate Analytics, which is more about freely accessible articles typically granted by the publisher. Next slide, Katie. So the changing landscape, the models. In the old days, which means about 20, 25 years ago, in an analog dominated world, you typically subscribed to a print journal yourself and arrived by mail. It was a benefit of society membership, getting that subscription. Your librarian would place an order with an agent, typically following a print checklist of journals they wanted. And this all was disseminated by the post, US mail. As we know, from the mid-90s, we had the advance and ubiquitous use of platform distribution. So print, electronic distribution of content to disseminate knowledge. What that gave rise to was consortia and database subscriptions, supplanting the individual a la carte subscriptions. A la carte subscriptions still happen, but the dominant player in the world are sometimes characterized as the big deal or consortia and database subscriptions. What that has given rise to is an audience being able to look at archives of back content that used to be trapped in print form. It has given rise to open access, all those different permutations of open access we saw in the earlier slide, as well as other variants to accessing journal content. It also has helped tear down the walls of different formats, books versus proceedings versus journal articles. So what we're seeing are hybrid book journal formats, which are appealing to authors. We're seeing extended review articles. We're seeing smaller review articles. We're even seeing the birth of brief research snapshots, which used to be relegated to poster form. This has implications, as we're seeing essentially with different formats, different content types, different ease of accessibility. You have multiple distribution channels. And ultimately what that means for a lot of publishers as well as society publishers, it's a battle for the end user, for the reader. Of course, this disruption, whether it's the technology, new entrants and new models, it makes for a changing landscape, and that sometimes can be a bit challenging, particularly when you're an editor-in-chief and are just looking to drive quality submissions and to output quality publications to benefit the science and to advance the field. Next slide, Katie. So with that being said, subscriptions versus open access are probably what's capturing a lot of people's attention. Subscription-based academic publishing is sometimes labeled as being in crisis. Collection sales models are based in stasis. Open access has been here from the early 2000s. It's growing each year, but it doesn't ultimately catalyze any fundamental change. There are still producer nations. You still have the United States dominating. You still have Western Europe dominating. You have China coming up fast as being not just a producer, but an audience itself. And if anything, if you're an editor-in-chief or an editorial board running a journal, you're aware of that this divergence around the world over supporters of open access versus subscription. a good case example is fundamental views from the European Union versus the USA. And sometimes this is labeled as an existential crisis of scholarly communications, but it's not all to worry about. Katie, next slide. Because fundamentally, it's not changing mostly.
That's right. Thanks, Aaron. And yeah, Aaron touched on a lot of good points in the overview of the landscape. And and today when we're here, really to kind of talk about submissions, and he said at the beginning, not one size fits all, and we're really kind of going to focus on these fundamentals. What's important? What's not changing? What's never going to change? Impact factors here I have listed at the top. Now, never, I don't know about that, but it's certainly a flawed metric. What you think of it doesn't really matter, because authors are still listing the impact factor as an important reason as to why they decided where to submit. And for now, the impact factor is still a very relevant metric. But the fundamentals of your journal, that's another key point here. Do you have a diverse editorial board? Do you have clear submission guidelines listed on your website? Do you have a website? I've encountered journals, even as recently as last year, that still didn't have a website. Do you have an up-to-date editorial board listed? And that's all really, going to end up ultimately affecting your submissions and how the peer review process gets there. You want to lower the bar to entry, and having all those fundamentals kind of tied up. And there's a lot of other items that could easily be webinars of their own. Having an easy to use peer review system, an engaged editorial board, responsive editorial office. Being quick with not just decisions, but being quick to respond to queries, being transparent and open with your authors, and the quality of the peer review. That's well, I mentioned that impact factors are still listed by authors and surveys as a big reason why they decided to submit, but the quality of that peer review that they receive from your reviewers is right up there next to it. If an author has a great experience during the submission process and the review process, and your reviewers make their paper better, they are going to come back. And wanting to build submission pipelines, it's that old kind of sales saying of it's easier to keep a customer than to get a new one. That's true. Repeat authors is where you're going to have a lot of success. So I guess Katie, next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. This is just a kind of for people familiar with how an impact factor is calculated. You're very familiar with this. This is despite that typo with the R after the numerator line. This is how historically the impact factor has been calculated. Clarivate has announced, well, they announced it, I think it was the day before Thanksgiving last year, a change for 2020. But only in the how that denominator, or excuse me, that denominator is going to be calculated, but some changes are going to happen. So if we go to the next slide, Katie. So while historically an article was counted based on the volume year in which that article published. So if you published an article online, early access, in say November of 2018, but that went into a January 2019 issue, for the impact factor, they would count that as a 2019 publication. The big change that's happening this year, and which will influence the impact factors that are released this June, is that early access articles now that are publishing, they count the article in the year that it published online. So if it's an early access article published in 2020, that will count in 2020, and not even if it went into an issue in 2021. So that's a change, and the result being a large number of journals are expected to receive a big bump in impact factor this year, which should though come back down to earth in 2022 with the release of the 2021 impact factor. Aaron, is there anything there that you wanted to say about that as well? I know we talked about it a bit.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. I think most people here on the call are picking up on the fact that, the 2021 Journal Citation Report, or JCR, will contain the 2020 impact factor. In other words, for any given year, the most recent impact factor, somewhat confusingly, has the year previous attached to it. So just remember, June of each year has the previous year's impact factor. And you had mentioned engagement. I think it's incredibly important for anyone on this call who's involved in journal publications to monitor communications from Clarivate Analytics with regard to citation counts, number one. Number two, for any initiatives, because it's in their best interest to be on the receiving proactive line of communication coming from Clarivate rather than trying to unpick it after the fact. And that's incredibly important because Clarivate, once they release those impact factors in June of every year, have corrections to that database. They do it typically at 2 points in the year, September, and then once again later in the fall. However, it's always best to flag any challenges before that impact factor is released so they can correct it before it's released. That's about it.
Next slide, Katie.
Benefits of society publications. So when John and I were discussing putting together the slide deck for today's presentation, we had a really enjoyable conversation because essentially society publications are where scholarly and research publishing all began. Groups of academics and researchers coming together to advance not only their discipline, but to enlarge their audience of other fellow scientists devoted to a particular research interest. In other words, the research helped cultivate a culture. So it's the research and the culture. Society publications are for academics by academics, for researchers by researchers. And you will have heard that John mentioned editorial board engagement with regard to fundamentals. That's an aspect of scholarly and research publishing that's not changing. That cannot be underscored more. Society publications, because they sit squarely in the field, in the respective field, leading that field about what's happening, those advances, having editorial board engagement, having active researchers on your masthead is fundamental to the success of that publication and ultimately fundamental for driving submissions. As you heard me say, you're advancing the field, you're serving your community, but there's another point here, and you'll see this on the last bullet. It's professional recognition. Many authors want to publish in publications followed by their colleagues, number one. Number two, they want to advance the field. And number three, ultimately, they want that professional recognition of doing so. Next slide. So, society publication strengths. Let's think about why authors publish. Well, number one, it's career advancement. Number two, with the more publications they have and the better recognition, it helps drive funding. Three, when you publish in society publications, there's a tacit understanding that there's credibility of results because this is that publication in a society journal comes with the, for lack of a better description, publishing amongst professionals. You're communicating with your peers. And of course, there again is the professional prestige. Next slide. How do authors choose? Now, here's a whole litany list, right? If you look at the main running heads, quality, reputation, how broad's the readership, the editorial process, each one of these could be its own presentation in and of itself. But let's just run down this quickly. For quality and reputation, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, an impact factor is a metric. And as we know, the impact factors are correlated to Clarivate Analytics to specific subfields. So within those subfields, maybe you're in molecular genetics, maybe you're in ecology, you'll have an impact factor and there will be a ranking. You can disagree with categorizing journals according to this, but ultimately at the end of the day, the audience tends to look for a metric to sort of indicate relative quality. Authors are also looking at articles published. No one wants to publish in a journal that has a good impact factor but has low output. And basically, the number three sub-bullet point is that they're going to rely upon the views of their peers, their colleagues, and supervisors. In addition, they're going to look at readership and distribution, the availability on the web, the scope of the journal versus that readership. Are they making a broad impact, or are they making an impact in a small community? And the last part, editorial process, that sometimes gets overlooked, but as a running head, but ultimately it's important, because something that Jon said about fundamentals, not just editorial board engagement, but turnaround times, from submission to acceptance, from acceptance to publication, right? How's the quality of peer review in that process? What's the editorial communication in that process? And perhaps we should have bolded the editorial communication in peer review, because many authors will submit to a particular journal knowing that the quality of the peer review and the editorial communication coming back to them will help them improve their paper and help improve the impact. Next slide. Society publication strengths. So we talked about authors. What do readers look for in a journal? And as you can see from this slide and what I'm about to tell you, is that essentially many of the attributes that make society publications punch above their weight are also what readers are looking for. They're looking for reputation. They're looking for reputation in editorial masthead, right? Is your editorial board engaged? Are the ones leading the field? Is the output of that journal indicative of that quality leading the field? What's the impact factor? That is a driving motivation for readers. Is it consistent in its quality? Is it consistent with the output? Is that view shared amongst the author's peers? And is that quality of publication, whether it's in a PDF or HTML, does it have high production values? Number one, it's visibility and finding it. But number two, how easy is it to pull data out of that paper and explore it for yourself? Does it invite discovery? And that ultimately comes down to high production values. Next slide. When we jump into the competitive landscape, thinking about, maybe I want to just go back in time a minute. I said that society publications often punch above their weight, and we know that. And how do we know that? Well, irrespective of how we look at impact factors, it's here to stay, at least for the time being. So let's think about that. You're an editor-in-chief, or you're an editorial board member of a society publication, and you want to drive submissions and you want to drive quality output, but it's competitive out there. And so let's think a little bit about that and think about how impact factor plays into that. And so there are two broad categories. There's a not-for-profit versus commercial journals. So those could be, say, maybe your publishing partner is an entity like Springer Nature or Wiley or Sage, right? You're a not-for-profit society, but you have a commercial publisher. Those commercial publishers also have their own proprietary titles, okay? Underneath that idea of proprietary titles beholden to a brand, not necessarily a society, there are this idea of glamour journals, which I characterize as SNC, or the Science, Nature, and Cell crowd, impact factors which are pretty high. Now, before we move on to the next slide, which I think will be a bit fun for everyone to explore, remember that generally speaking, society journals punch above their weight. Katie, next slide. So, are all journals the same, or are some journals more equal than others? And so what we've done here in preparing the slide is, and these are not hard, fast, these are just general rankings or general ways to assess. Basically, the top of the champagne tree are impact factor journals ranging from 10 to 44. Those are the top general journals. So most often Science, Nature, Cell Brands. Impact factors ranging from 2 to 10. Those are the top specialist journals. You should circle that because many times those are our society publications helping leading their respective fields. It also includes somewhat newer entrants like Public Library of Science at eLife. And then the third category are impact factors ranging from 0 to 2. These are specialist journals, and maybe it's not fair not to call them top specialist journals, but essentially they may be more niche. They could be society publications, or they could be proprietary to a commercial publisher. And then the bottom tier, and it doesn't mean that they're the worst of the lot. All it means is that they don't have impact factors, right? Unfortunately, Clarivate Analytics has a very thorough evaluation process, and it's very distilled. Typically, a journal has to publish for about 3 years consecutively before they even think about indexing it in one of its major products. Generally speaking, these are new titles. These are specialist journals, which are relying upon a commissioned article pipeline, maybe a collection of focus issues, and typically come from emerging communities that are advancing subsections of science. Next slide. And that brings us to society publications and their audience. Everything that we've talked about thus far is generally speaking about how to increase submissions through society publications and earmarking the ideas or underscoring the ideas of reputation and quality and engagement within the audience. So when Jon and I put together this slide, we were thinking essentially, all right, how to distinguish your publication? We have the editorial board engagement. We have the society reputation. But when I was talking with Jon came up with a very good point here and said, it's not just about the society publications and about the leadership. Remember that we've had disruption to the market. We've had disruption to the market with new digital tools and platforms helping disseminate knowledge worldwide. We've had movements that jumped on to these digital tools like open access, with advocates saying, subscription publication was dependent upon an analog model where everything was done in an analog fashion and using mail and post for distribution. Those same technological tools also benefit societies and publications in terms of proactive marketing. Because you remember we had a sub-bullet point that's a battle for the end user, for the author to get the better quality submissions. But it's also, those same tools provide an opportunity to reaching your end audience, the reader, and to reach them directly, and something that societies can take advantage of. So traditionally, you had society marketing, and that would be, as we saw much earlier in the presentation, that was based on the analog world. So print materials, conference distribution, newsletters, and so forth. That disruptive technology places tools in one hand. So now we have websites for individual societies. We have electronic newsletters coming from the societies. There are written blogs. There are video logs. Social media has become an incredible phenomenon. We're all familiar with Facebook. Increasingly, the professional LinkedIn social media site is one where it's advancing science. You also have Instagram, and lastly, we have Twitter, which has seen a phenomenal amount of usage during the pandemic when used as a social media tout for virtual conferences. And so what that means, thank you, Katie, for social media, is something that's very important that society publications need to be aware. Social media, and I'm going to use Twitter here largely because I think it's, during the pandemic, it's one which has seen a real use that can be documented in terms of followers, followings, and tweets and likes. And what makes social media and something like Twitter particularly useful is that journals are able, and particularly society journals, are able to establish their brand with the end user. And if you see this, this slide, you'll see the subpoint, journals with dedicated accounts versus subject clusters. Now, this is important. It's very rare that a marketer at a commercial publisher will have the bandwidth and the time to set up individual journal accounts and to market them on behalf of the many, many journals that they may have underneath their remit. And why this is important for societies is that it offers the ability, the social media tools, to allow individual journals to have a journal-specific account, right? These are typically only done with a dedicated social media editor. So many editorial mastheads will add a social media editor, typically an early career researcher who is reading the literature anyways, wants to be involved in publications. And so they establish a social media editor to help foster postings to social media, in this case, Twitter. And then the important part here is that it's not the fact that that the journal or the society journal has to do so much heavy lifting, is that the lifting isn't that heavy, right? It can complement the many types of channel marketing that perhaps your commercial publishing partner are accomplishing. There's a whole litany list of what commercial publishers do for their publishing partners, but the real opportunity is for the journal, for the society journal itself, is to be able to think about cultivating its own audience among its membership, as well as related communities outside of that, and have those followers have individual exchanges with not only their current authors, but potential authors. And that's something that's very easily controllable. You'll see here on this slide, we took a screenshot, and you will see the fact that this is coming from Twitter. And it has a short, even an abstract of an abstract about the benefits of publishing in the Journal of Histochemistry, right? So there's a good takeaway message here, which the reader can assimilate, in about 20, 30 seconds. And you'll also know that there's branding particular to the journal level. So you see up there in the upper left-hand corner, a little icon indicative of that journal. That's incredibly important, right? Because that provides the ability for an end user receives or sees this Twitter to be able to say, hey, I want to follow that journal. I want to know what this journal is up to because I'm interested potentially in making my next article submission to this journal. Next slide. Jon had spoke about fundamentals earlier. That's also incredibly important. With fundamentals, a new aspect of fundamentals is in getting engagement with your authors, right? Think about images, video, and multimedia. So authors often want to tout their individual articles, and that's often done through images, video, multimedia. So that could be something as simple as graphical abstracts, which means that there is an image associated with the article that's analogous to the way a journal issue would have a cover. In some fields where maybe the images don't lend themselves to be indicative of that article, maybe you're talking about epidemiological studies and flat out the numbers just don't produce a compelling image, say for Twitter, then think about a department image for those articles as a way to brand them. Also think about video blogs, which can sometimes be a two-way street for promotion. So it could be something coming from the author themselves, touting their work that can be embedded or added into social media. And back to this whole point of fundamentals, the fundamental idea here is to enable your authors. And what better way to get your authors engaged is not after the article publishes, but get them thinking about it when they submit through their peer review systems. Right? That means think about images, videos, multimedia, and taglines submitted by the author, approved by the author, albeit with ultimate approval by the editorial masthead of the journal, but get them thinking about submitting that stuff into the online peer review system. So when that article is accepted for publication, all the components of proactive marketing are already in the pipeline, not only for if you have a commercial publisher partner, not only for the marketing staff at the publishing house, but also for the editorial masthead and the potential for a social media editor, as well as get the author ability to self-promote from first instance of publication. And so we've done some screenshots here. You, of course, will see SPY with the top image right there. So SPY not only has the branding on the society level inside the circle, it also has a short abstract about what makes this article so particularly interesting, along with a graphical abstract being pulled automatically into the Twitter feed, and it self-promotes itself from there, right? The author, SPY can push it, the author can retweet it and know that he has or she has clean copy that's ready to go for a worldwide audience. Below that, we have a screenshot from PLOS One, the Public Library of Science, a not-for-profit endeavor that has a variety of different community journals ranging in impact factors from 2 to 10. They also have the PLOS branding. They also do the graphical abstracts. They also have an abstract right there which capsulizes the nuance of the article and why the reader should engage. Next slide. And I know I've rattled on. I know, and Jon has added fundamental points here. But ultimately, what we wanted to do today was to present to everyone the fact that driving submissions, particularly to society publications, is something that rests upon fundamentals. And even though there may be disruption happening across the publishing landscape, that there are fundamentals, both traditional ones as well as new tools, which are in society journal editors, and society authors' hands to be able to push and promote their quality content, which in turn will help drive reciprocity, help drive submissions back to the journal. So we leave you with a quote from Lewis Carroll. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. We know we've touched upon a lot of different points today. Each one of these points could be its own presentation in and of itself. But we like to, and mindful of the time right now, we're going at 38 minutes past the hour, to provide enough time, 20 minutes or so, for Q&A discussion. Also, just as an FYI, I know we touched upon a lot of points right here. We did so somewhat in a breezy fashion. We have prepared a glossary of terms coming from today's presentation for everyone here. That glossary of terms are also hyperlinked back to sources, number one. Number two, created an impact factor toolkit. Perhaps toolkit is a little too complex. It's probably more along the lines of a cheat sheet to help those navigate looking at citations within Clarivate Analytics. And future forums here will be on text and data mining. However, with that being said, if you have any questions, please use the chat and our moderators at BioOne will kickstart the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jon and Aaron. Yes, we are excited for, yeah, we're so excited for your questions. Again, please use the question panel in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And for those interested in the glossary impact factor toolkit and the benefits of society publications, those will all be included in the email that you get following the presentation. And we already have had some questions come in, so I'm very excited to get started. Again, we're looking for more questions and we have plenty of time. So the first question is a two-parter. Do you have any strategies for driving OA uptake in hybrid journals? And the second part is I would love for you to comment on as well. You know, OA uptake is tied to the ability to pay from funders and institutions, and so it is difficult for publishers to influence outside of read and publish deals. So I'd love to get your comments and thoughts on that question and comment.
Jon, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, that answers to that question. Those questions could actually be an entire webinar. But for hybrid journals, looking to increase your OA presence, I think it's it really depends on what you're looking to do. I mean, are you talking about having a gold OA article, or is green OA, depositing the author accepted manuscript, enough? Or are you really looking to drive, more of your version of record into having a CC-BY license? And so, that goes back to one of the very early slides on all the different versions of open access. But for I think purposes of answering the question, we'll consider it publishing an article with a CC-BY license in a subscription journal. Strategies for doing that are you need to really consult. Well, if you're working with a commercial publisher, you're definitely going to want to consult with them. But even if not, you're going to want to check your contracts that you have with your subscribers. And in most cases, at least in all of the cases in the journals that I have worked on in the past and subscriptions, there are triggers where you need to refund subscribers. And so if you publish over 10% of your content open access, subscribers need a price break or a refund. And that percent may change. That 10% was just I'm just kind of pulling it out of thin air. There may be different percentages, but you want to check that. And but if you're publishing in an area where authors are comfortable with it, I think being clear about your policies and that you're open to that. And if you're really, with anything with a shift to open access, being willing to waive some of those APCs, if you're charging APCs for that, to really kind of kickstart it, get people comfortable with the idea of doing it in your journal. Aaron,
That's a really good point. And with Jon's last point in mind with regard to waiving APCs, a good strategy to make the audience aware is that, say, the journal so-and-so is open for open access submissions, is that ultimately the editor-in-chief sometimes has a number of waivers, say, from the publisher, or they have a number of waivers that's allowed within their page budget for a given year. And to number one, either invite key feature articles, which become which are promoted as being an invitation article, making that open access and touting that, right? Number one. Number two is when you have a regular submission that's really going to particularly advance the field, but maybe the authors doesn't have funding and they're from a developing area, is whether you have a formal open access waiver policy where the author is interested in open access but lacks the funds. Both are just tactical suggestions for engagement, but making sure that hybrid status of the journal is well known among the community and that there are flexible tools for accommodating open access. A third point, which might be considered, is a benefit of society publications. Some societies have a discounted open access fee for their journals as a benefit of membership. So if the public APC for non-members is, say, 3,300, of the garden variety Wiley APC fee, for the Society of so-and-so, perhaps that's just $1,000 APC. And that's something that, if you don't have the tools in place or the mechanisms in place, it's probably in a journal's best interest to start making an assessment of the advantages and disadvantages versus the competition with regard to how to foster open access.
Wonderful, thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in. Let's see, the next one is, many thanks for this great presentation. Can you elaborate a bit on the reputation of the SJMAGO journal ranks compared to the JCR impact factor?
Ali, could you repeat that first set of initials?
SJMAGO.
Yeah, I mean, I could start real quick, and that is just, again, this goes back to kind of, defining excellence, and each journal really needs to decide for themselves, and each society needs to decide for themselves how are they going to define excellence. And when it comes to other ranking systems, they're the more, as far as I'm concerned, the more metrics, the better. I like metrics. I like ways of measuring things. Every metric is flawed. Every metric can be gamed in one way or another, but they are still kind of valuable when you're trying to evaluate your own publishing program. When how valuable other metrics are versus the impact factor, I think our point is that right now, when you look at author surveys, and that's when we're talking about submissions, how we get submissions. Right now, that impact factor is still being ranked very high, and it's being ranked higher than any other metric. Is it the best metric to evaluate a journal? That's debatable, and there are plenty of other valid metrics, and some of them have better features than others. But you know what? The impact factor has some good features too when used the proper way, the correct way. I'm kind of giving a non-answer other than just to say that the impact factor is still kind of trumping other metrics at this point. And back to what Aaron talked about during the presentation, regardless of what you think of it and what you think the best metric is, the wider community of authors is still kind of beholden to the impact factor, and they will be so long as their tenure committees still look at that as when evaluating whether or not to grant promotions.
Thank you. And I think that's the tenure committee note is a very important one, because it's a reminder that, we have a lot of these kinds of discussions in scholarly publishing, but what we do is so connected to university protocols and institutional norms, and especially to library markets as well. I have a couple more questions on social media. The first is there a limit on how much you ask authors for, such as graphical abstracts, Twitter taglines, lay summaries, before it starts discouraging authors from submitting?
That's a great question. And, Jon, I'll jump on this one. Right. So subtly, what the suggestions put forth in engaging authors at manuscript submission, all authors, I think, recognize that manuscript submission can be an onerous bear, irrespective if you're submitting to a society publication, a commercial publisher. There are so many different steps that have to happen. However, in my experience, and I think generally in the experience of most authors, they don't mind submitting a Twitter abstract or 2-sentence pitch, as well as making a suggestion for a graphical abstract for the image. And the best place to do that is at manuscript submission, when the author has all of the key details, all of the text, all of the images, and they're already uploading that. So you're adding a relatively small time element to a task that they've already mentally prepared themselves to do. And the downstream benefit is when their article may get accepted and ultimately becomes published, they will be thanking you for the preparation that you forced them into, because they're immediately able to tweet about it. And considering, again, looking at Twitter, how many particularly early career researchers have their own followings of like-minded peers, anywhere from 400 to 1,000 is not unusual for an early career researcher. That's quite a bit of proactive marketing that's in the hands, literally, of the author. So it's a great question, but the benefit outweighs the time negative. So I would say you just need to figure out how to make it work, talk to your editors, talk to your staff, and come up with a very simple way to do so. You may know that one of the appendices is a sample social media. I think it's about a page and a third. I would really, when you receive it, look it over. You tell me that's pretty simple, not very complex. And if you have any questions, just reach out to John or myself and we'd be happy to answer them. But it's a great question, but one which should not be dismissed. I really think that for society publications, I think fundamentally that's one that needs to be embraced, is social media.
Wonderful. And along those lines, do you recommend that with social media promotion that you pay attention to what audience you want, an academic audience or a non-academic audience, and do these require different approaches in your experience?
You know, that's a great question. So let's say you were attending the European Geosciences Union last year, May, or getting ready for EGU this year. Yeah, you might have copy for a particular technical article that is appropriate to scientific audiences because maybe it published in, say, the Journal of Earth Sciences, right? And you just want to promote this article, so you latch on to the EGU 2021 hashtag. So you know that EGU 2021 hashtag is probably got a few thousand people following it because they're getting ready for the virtual hybrid conference, right? And so that may be apropos. You might also want, if you have an article that's applicable to the general or layperson audience. So think policymakers, and by policymakers, think about elected officials who approve grants or vote on funding, and then subsequently that gets sent, you know, let's increase NIH's funding, and that gets sent to NIH and it goes to a grant panel. You might want to think about an elevator pitch of 1 to 2 sentences. I know I'm not being very clear to you. The clarity here is, if you have articles which cross over into the public lay interest domain, then it's probably in your best interest to make sure you have an elevator pitch that explains the science in layman or layperson's terms, as well as an abstract for the research audience. Not every journal will have that facility, but many do, and that's a great question.
Wonderful. And we have 2 more questions. I think we'll just have enough time. This is a question that I get a lot from the publishing societies that BioOne works with, and it's about how increasing articles published might impact the impact factor. And I was curious to get your thoughts on that. Would it adding another issue or doing special, what impact would adding another issue or special issues have?
That's,
sure.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick, but I mean, I think, yeah, that's always a concern. You know, I've worked with a number of different societies over my 16 years in journals, and you know, there's always been a concern that if you know, increase your output, you're going to lower your impact factor. And my personal goal, whenever increasing output, was trying to keep our impact factor flat. I would see flat as a success, because, you know, if you are increasing your denominator, you're going to lower your impact factor. So, you know, if you're able to increase your output, you know, you should adjust any kind of goals you have, I think would be my message, and really aim for flat while you're building. Now, having said that, you know, if you've got good fundamentals and you know, you're you know, really trying to, you know, getting a lot of repeat authors, it doesn't necessarily mean you are definitely going to lower your impact factor by increasing your output. I've seen examples of journals that have you know, continued to grow right alongside their impact factor, and so, you know, it's definitely, you know, a concern, and I think, you know, just being kind of open and communicative amongst you know, each other, the editorial board, let everybody know that, listen, we want to capture more content, we want to contribute more to the scholarly record. As a trade-off, our impact factor may go down that's okay.
That's a great. Yeah, John made a great point there. It's about the mission and vision for the journal. The impact factor is not the primary data point that you're chasing. You know, Katie, John and I included an ancillary slide at the end, a couple of them. Could you go to one of those? Go beyond that one. Next one. Right. So the one before this one. Yep, right here. So this is the alchemy publications per year. Maybe your journal is meant to be the journal of record, capturing a subsection of the field, but maybe that field's going underneath exponential growth, but your page budgets. So maybe the field's growing by 10% year on year, but your page budgets are only growing at 2%. So you're not necessarily bringing in the new communities, the new researchers advancing the field. So even though you may be growing with the field, your percentage of market share in communities, early career researchers, may be following. So if you go to the next slide, the one below, bingo, percentage of topical publications per year is falling. So if you're thinking about adding issues and adding new communities, that's a discussion you need to have with your Society Publications Committee with regard to what are our goals for publications? Is it to maintain market share? Is it to foster the science and the researchers coming up behind us? You know, what are our key performance indicators by which we will gauge year upon year success? And John, I'd like to thank you. That's a great point to have pounded home.
And in our final moments, given the challenges that societies are currently facing, where do you think it's most important to focus publishing resources?
Great question. In a nutshell, I think the fundamental place to focus resources is on the editorial masthead. It can't be a vision of one person. You know, research, publications and research are intertwined and connected. You know, I don't have it, we didn't prepare a slide for it, but in and around 2003, the number of R01 grants that were multi-authored increased for the first time. So prior to 2003, there were individual authors. After 2003, there were multiple authors pointing to interdisciplinary studies, which is a way of introducing the fact that society publications are very much a team effort. You need editorial leadership, which is engaged with the community and which is worldwide. If you're seeking a worldwide audience, number one. Number two, if you have limited financial resources, I think it's best to invest that in the editorial board masthead, the publication output per year, and then social media, taking advantage of those tools which allow society publications to literally punch above their weight in the digital realm.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Aaron, nailed it. That's research is you can do this. You can check these statistics on for your own individual subject category, but globally research is exploding. And that isn't just Europe, the U.S., Asia. That is Africa. That is South America. The amount of research coming out is increasing every year in nearly every subject area. And having a diverse, inclusive editorial board that's going to really pay dividends. Even if you are a regional journal, a regional U.S.-based journal or a state-specific journal, you can still reaching out and having those board members from different regions is going to pay dividends. And I'm sorry I need to sign off now. But thank you everyone, and
thanks, John.
To reach out.
Thank you, John. And that concludes all of our questions. Thank you to John, who just left, and thank you also to Aaron for such an informative webinar and forum discussion. For those in the audience, please feel free to reach out to John or Aaron. Their email addresses are here. They will also be in the email that you get at the conclusion My email is also below, alexandra@bioone.org. We also encourage you to fill out the 3-question survey in the email that you'll get that will help us identify new topics for these forums so that they can best address publisher questions and concerns. And we are looking forward to another forum next quarter on text and data mining. And so I thank you all again for joining me for the forum this morning for this discussion, and apparently for a bite of yogurt as well. So thank you all and be well.
Thank you all. Thanks, Allie. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too.